So, hi everybody. Today we are going to start talking about mixing. And mixing is the project of making our music sound as good as it can be. It's the difference between sounding professional and not sounding professional. And it also is a window into a kind of different ear training practice than the normal one that we do in music school. In music school, it's all about notes and chords. The ear training that you learn when you do mixing and music production is all about this whole frequency spectrum, and not just the fundamentals of each pitches, but also their overtones. And so you could call it kind of a spectral ear training practice that comes out of mixing that I think is good for us as musicians, even if we don't end up doing a lot of music production mixing. So I want to introduce you to the most important effect that you have in the whole bunch of effects here. What's up, Phil? We're starting to talk about mixing today, and you've all got projects that are starting to sound good. I'm really excited about them. And so this is the first step in working on the sound quality of those to make them sound as good as they can be. So I think the most important effect that we have is EQ. EQ is the only effect that I put on every single track all the time. And whenever I EQ a sound, I am usually just doing one of four techniques. And so I'm going to show you all four of those techniques today. Phil, you can go into the chat and download this project I've made a link for, and we'll work from there. So EQ is all about giving our music clarity. I'm going to share my screen here. Sound. Can you see my screen here? Yeah? Okay. Thumbs up. So let's talk through the EQ graph. I almost always use EQ8. There's a couple of other EQs in Ableton, but they're really, I don't know, this is made more for kind of a DJ situation where you just want a couple of, you don't want fine-tune control. You've just got 3 knobs, and EQ3 is the same. It's just a couple of knobs. EQ8 is where you get a great graph that represents the sound that you're hearing, and you can change it in lots of ways. So let me just talk through what you're looking at. This may be obvious, maybe it's not. I'm just gonna go through it like you've never seen something like this before. So we're looking at a spectrum graph here. We have numbers along the x-axis that go from about 20 to about 20,000. And that's frequency. So 20 is about the lowest note that you can hear. Below 20 isn't actually a pitch, it sounds like a rhythm. Above 20,000, we don't hear. Actually above, 17, 18, 19,000 as you get older becomes the top of human hearing range. You'll notice that the numbers are not going linearly. The distance between 100 and 1,000 is the same as the distance between 1,000 and 10,000. And that's because frequency is on a logarithmic scale. If you have a note that's 100 hertz, 100 cycles per second, an octave above that, the same pitch, is 200, and an octave above that is 400, and an octave above that is 800. So you can see how the steps between octaves get bigger and bigger as you double the frequency to get higher and higher octaves. So that's frequency. We'll divide the frequency graph into a couple of different areas, just kind of informally. This is the low end. We've got the mid-range in here, and we might talk about low mids or high mids. And then the high end is up here. The y-axis is amplitude, and it's measured in decibels. So this is how loud any particular frequency is. A decibel is a unit of loudness, and it's a little hard to quantify. Somebody told me once that going up 3 decibels doubles the perceived volume. I'm not sure how to even evaluate that, because it's just not a sense that we have very fine tuning in. It's hard for us to know, really measure like what's twice as loud as something else. But 0 means we're not changing things at all. And below that, we're cutting. Above that, we're boosting. So the blue line is a curve that we can draw with the use of filters, filter nodes. We can draw a curve that can boost different parts of the frequency spectrum or cut different parts of the frequency spectrum. We have 8 filters down here, and you can turn them on and off with these buttons, and they appear with their numbers up above. Each of these you could call a filter node. You can drag it around, and it has a couple of different properties. It has a frequency, which is how far left or right it is. It maps to this knob. It has gain, which is how high or low it is. Gain, which is like the change in the amplitude. More or less volume, but not exactly. So gain, you can turn up and down here as well. And it also has Q. So Q is one other parameter about the shape of the filter. In bell curve filters like this, Q is the width of it. So a higher Q gives you a narrower filter. And there's one more property of each filter, and that is the shape of it. So we've got a whole bunch that we can choose from here. These two are called low cuts because they cut the lows. The volume of everything below this frequency point with a slope. So it's a gradual fall off. I mean, this is a pretty steep slope, but it's not an exact slope at 563, but yeah, 563, and it'll start falling away in volume, and then there's no sound here. This is a less steep low cut filter. This is a shelf, which lets you cut a whole even line below a certain frequency or boost it. This is a bell curve. You'll use this one a lot, as well as the low cuts. This is a notch if you want to cut a specific frequency exactly or a whole range. And then you have a high shelf, which is just the inverse of the other shelf, and you have a high cut and a more extreme high cut. If you turn up Q on a high cut, you get a boost in frequency at that cutting point. It gets more resonant there. So let's see what else. You'll notice that the moving around the nodes is really just a kind of proxy for controlling both the frequency and the gain at the same time. These are interchangeable.
Hey,
and
okay.
Yeah, question.
Why is there like a concept of negative gain? Like, why doesn't it just, if no sound, just start at 0?
Because this isn't actually no sound. Check it out. We're gonna play some on this track. Sorry, that's probably kind of loud. So when this line is all set to 0, when the blue line is all along 0, it means there's no change. And the sound that comes in is the same as the sound that comes out. And so we'll turn down from there, and we can make the low end softer. So this is all about change, but you'll also notice, you've probably thought about how 0 here is like full volume, and below that are negative numbers. Zero's an important point here because above that, and you start getting distortion. So you can just think of this as like full, and this is like less than full. We always want to turn things down from here because our values from the different tracks get added together. If you have 0 on one track, if it's, full on one track and full on another track, and those get mixed into the master track, then the master track will overflow. So we're always pulling things down, and same with EQ. We're much more often cutting frequencies than we are boosting frequencies, though we do some boosting, because we're trying to make space for everything to fit. The more layers you are, the more headroom you need, the more space. Good question. Feel free to stop me anytime, anybody, if you need to hear something again or have a question. Notice there's also a gain here, which means that you can just turn up volume after this happens. So one way you can think about things is if you want to boost this range, you can just boost it, or you could cut everything but it and then boost everything. Just two different ways to control volume, given that you're trying to manage how much volume you have at any point so that you don't overflow. This EQ is really great because it has this visualization. And so we can actually see the sound that we're hearing. And this is how we're going to start using this as an ear training exercise. So here's the basic practice. And I recommend, if you want to go deep with this, I recommend doing this exercise that I'm about to show you on every sound that you work with. This is how you can learn what's actually going on in each of your sounds, and you'll be able to make more informed choices as you mix. And that is the sweep. So the sweep goes like this. You take a bell curve, you choose a width for it. You just kind of guess this. Too wide and you won't learn so much, too narrow and you won't learn so much. We're just going to pick something in between. And you boost it as high as it'll go. And then you loop the sound that you want to hear and study. I'm going to do this kick drum. And then you sweep down and listen to how the sound changes. And you'll hear pop out different aspects of the sound. And you'll learn things like, wow, there's actually a lot of really high-end noise up on this kick drum. And you'll hear that there's a real kind of percussive, thumpy clack around here. It's the most punchy when you get here. And then when you get down here, you'll notice that there's a lot of tone. And that's kind of the sub-bass tone of a kick drum. And then you'll get down here and you won't hear anything. And you'll say, why don't I hear, even though I see energy in this frequency? And that's because below a certain point, our speakers just don't do it. Even big bassy club speakers don't go to the bottom of this graph. So I'd like you to give this a try. Loop, you can select and press Command L on this first kick, or pick any of these kicks. I chose kicks here because you normally don't think about the kick as being a very complex sound. It's just like a low thump, right? But as you go exploring, you'll hear the different layers and the different aspects of a kick drum in the different frequency ranges. So pick one, loop it, pick a bell curve. You may have to choose bell curve from the list here, and then do a high sweep all the way through and check it out. And we'll circle back in about 2 minutes. Cool, come on back and I want to show you a trick. There's a button here called the audition button. Looks like a pair of headphones. And when you turn it on, it actually mutes all of the sound that's not covered by the filter while your finger is down on the mouse as you're dragging the filter. So this gives you even better ears on just each different part of the frequency spectrum. So why don't you put those audition on and listen to a couple of these, scan through a couple of these kick drums. All right, is this making sense?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I didn't see any difference.
You don't hear a difference?
Yeah, I didn't hear any difference.
There's only a difference while you're holding your mouse down. So I'll show you here. While it's playing, it's not different. But when I click and hold on the particular filter, everything goes away except the sound underneath that bell curve.
Okay. Got it.
But then I let go and it all comes back. Does that work for you?
Yeah, thanks.
Great, sure. Okay, so now we're going to get into the 4 EQ techniques that you need to know. The first is called EQ bracketing. And I'm going to jump over to this bit of guitar music that I put together. This is a piece I've been working on that uses sounds recorded by my friends. I have a friend who did a project, like I started a collaborative project where you can record quiet sounds and upload them to a folder, and then you could download other people's quiet sounds and make music out of it. And so a bunch of us are making an album out of little recordings of quiet sounds by other people. So my friend Quinn uploaded these samples of guitar harmonics, and somebody else uploaded this recording of a refrigerator that I've pitched to be in the same key as the guitar harmonics, and I put those harmonics in a drum rack and played these patterns. So let's EQ this guitar part because it needs it. I'm gonna solo the guitar track, so we're just gonna work there. So the first thing I'm going to do is put an EQ8 on here and take a look at what I'm hearing. So the first thing I notice is that there's so much low end, but I don't hear it. It's not actually part of the sound that I want. It's actually kind of mysterious to me. What is that sound? Why don't I hear it? I'm going to audition it just to check it out. Okay, so it's just the thump of the attacks on those notes. Only here do I start hearing tone. So what we do with EQ bracketing is put a low cut filter, maybe also a high cut filter, but almost always for me a low cut filter to cut out parts of the sound that I don't want. I'm going to use a more gentle curve here so I don't make a kind of unnatural cut. But I'm going to sweep up from the low end until I hear myself cutting some of the frequency that I like. Then I'm going to pull it back. Okay, so that's too far because the sound is starting to get thin. So something like this. Sometimes sounds have high end that we don't want also, a little noise up high. And even if it's not much or not very annoying, well, check this out. There's a little bit, if I boost it, that I just don't need. So I'm gonna do a hard cut right at that top point. Sounds that we don't hear, you might think, well, if we don't hear them, what's the problem? How are they gonna, how's it gonna bother us? But it still takes energy to produce those frequencies, even if we don't hear them, and they're gonna compete with other things that we have in the mix. Up here, it'll compete with our hi-hat and other kinds of noise. And down here, it'll compete with our kick drum and bass. So I've bracketed out the parts of the sound that are most useful to me. So why don't you take a moment and do the same thing. Listen as you sweep up the low cut filter here and find a good place for it. So you're not losing any of the sound, but we're cutting lots of that unnecessary low end. How'd that go? Does the idea make sense? We want to use EQ to cut out parts of the sound that we don't want. Lots of sound has low rumble in it. And if we leave it all in, it'll just make a muddy mess down in the bottom of our mix. Okay, so here's our next technique. After we've done EQ bracketing, we're going to do tone shaping. And tone shaping is using gentle curves just to bring out the most attractive parts of the sound and maybe cut a little bit the less attractive parts of the sound. Tone shaping is all about small moves. We're not trying to do anything drastic here, just make what's there sound a little better. So here's something I notice about this sound. Its role is obviously to be a high melodic sparkly sound. but it actually sounds kind of dull. So I'm going to do a little bit of tone shaping. I'm going to do that same ear training exercise we did before, maybe with a bit wider cue, with the audition. So I'm going to sweep and listen for the most attractive, bright, pingy part of the sound where it's really going to cut through. So to me, that's about there. And I'm going to narrow my cue and give it just like a 3 dB boost. I'm not trying to do anything really drastic here. Because I want the natural quality of the sound mostly to come through. If you make lots of really big changes, you'll end up drastically changing the character of the instrument. But I also feel like it's kind of muddy and thick down here. So I'm going to do another one of these and find the least attractive part of the sound. It's kind of this down here. It's just a bit of a muddy ringing. So once I've found my frequency, it can be tempting to just try to pull the node straight down, but you're going to lose that frequency point because you can't really control your mouse that well. So I always find it, grabbing the node, but then make the gain adjustment on the knob to preserve the frequency. So there's some nice warmth there. I don't want to get rid of it all. I just want to rebalance it a little bit. So maybe like -2. And I just want it to be a little bit brighter still. So I'm going to see just what happens if I, with the higher end. Yeah, I'm going to widen this cue and bring it up a little bit so I get. Cool. So just to compare, this is off and on. Clearer, less muddy. So why don't you spend a moment and approximate something like this. Use your ears, use the sweeping to find the brightest, most attractive part of the sound, sweep to find the least attractive part of the sound, and make a couple of gentle curves just to bring out what you like and suppress what you don't. Is everybody getting a sparklier version of this sound?
I made mine sound a little more muted, but I kind of like how it's.
Yeah, this is all about learning what you like. Follow your ears. I will say that the number one problem in most mixes is that there's too much stuff in the mids, and it sounds kind of muddy and chunky and not bright enough. And when you really study really excellent professional mixes, there's actually some space in here, and they're brighter than the average stuff we do at home. Okay, let's talk about the next technique. And for that, I'm going to actually grab a second EQ8, just so that we can keep this simple shape and not start making a really complex thing here. Sometimes I will use multiple EQs that represent like different parts of the thought process. So the next one is called Search and Destroy. And this is where we make narrow notches in our EQ graph to remove specific frequencies or tame certain frequencies. So in some sounds, there are certain frequencies that get really, really resonant for whatever reason. It's some function of the microphone or some function of the room or just an acoustic property of that particular instrument or sound. There are some frequencies that get overloaded with energy, and they need to be tamed. And the way that we know that something like this is necessary is if we just start getting annoyed by the sound. If we're hearing something again and again and we start to get annoyed by it, it's probably not the whole sound. It's possible that it's just one or two frequencies that are grating. And here's how to find them and destroy them. First, you get a bell curve. We're going to do a sweep, but this time we're going to sweep with the narrowest Q. So we're listening to just very, very specific frequency ranges. And I'm going to listen and watch and look for the moment when the picture, when the visualization leaps way up, and maybe it distorts, maybe it just gets really loud. But we're looking for moments when we touch them that they leap. We're looking for the loudest spots. So there is something. If I boost it there, I get this extra, little bit overloaded ringing. So once you find a spot, then turn down the gain knob. It is one of the notes of the guitar. It's one of the notes that's playing, so I don't want to cut it all the way. I just want to tame it a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing again, because I think that there's something going on down here. High Q, high gain, sweep. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of that kind of low muddiness of the sound when I boost here. And again, it's two notes of the guitar, but I can tell that they're rubbing against each other. Ooh, there's that note. And right next door there's ooh. So we've got, of this chord, the major seventh and the root. And I think that that half step here is part of what's muddy and too much about this. So again, it's a beautiful note in the chord. Putting it at the bottom is probably the most dissonant place to put that note. So I'm just going to tame it a little bit. let's compare. I'll loop a smaller portion of this so it's easier to. So it's just, you could say it's a little thinner, but it's definitely more clear. So that's the trade-off that we're making. Is like we're taking out a little of its over thickness in the interest of clarity here. I'm still seeing a lot of this stuff that we don't quite need, so I'm going to switch over here to a more extreme cut. Yeah, I didn't hear any loss of warmth or anything here, so I think that was an okay move to do. All right, so why don't you practice on this? Do a search and destroy. Narrow bell curve, sweep, look for extra ringy bits, turn them down a little bit, or a lot. Use your ears. You can use Audition or not, as you like. How's this going? Cool. So that's search and destroy. Again, for me, I know I need to do search and destroy when I'm annoyed by something and I don't know why. it helps things sit better in a mix too. You can, instead of turning something down and making it all quieter to get it in the right place, you can just turn down the parts of it that are the most annoying, and it'll sit better without losing volume. This is especially useful when you are EQing voices, because for whatever reason, microphones, voices, there's often lots of extra resonant frequencies in voices. Okay, let's talk about the last technique, but first I want to get into this other track. So this is kind of my bass, quote unquote, bass track, this refrigerator. And why don't you do this on your own now? Put an EQ on this track. It was really quiet. You can turn it up to hear it. And do two of these techniques. Do EQ bracketing. So we'll bracket off the parts that we don't need. And then do some tone shaping. Do some gentle curves to bring out the parts of the sound that you think are desirable and cut parts that you think are not desirable. And I'll do the same thing, and you can loop back and see if we made similar choices or different choices. So do those things, bracketing and tone shaping, and we'll circle back in 3 or 4 minutes. Here's a question. If I mute myself, computer audio also get muted. I'm going to mute myself and hit play, and put thumbs up if you hear it. You don't hear it? Or you did hear it? You did hear it. Okay. Then I'll just wait till y'all are done to do mine. Okay, let me go through and do mine and you can see how my choices compare to yours. So the first thing I notice, a lot of rumbly low end. I'm going to sweep up from here and listen to where I start caring about the sound. Don't care, don't care. Rumble, don't care. There's my tone. So I want to keep that. Ooh. I want to keep that. And above. Just going to check and see if I prefer the more gentle slow. No. Okay. Next, I just want to get to know this sound. It fuses the whole spectrum. If I'm just using it for the bass, maybe I only need the low end. Is there stuff up here that I want? I'm going to sweep to find out. Noise. Some tone. Here it starts getting pretty muddy. Quite muddy. And then there's that deep, beautiful bass tone. So my first thought might be, what do I need any of this for if I'm just using it as a bass? But when I cut down to here, I realize that I miss a lot of it. It loses its quality of being a refrigerator. I no longer hear that. It just sounds like a messy bass. So I actually want to keep this high-end stuff as part of that noise is part of the aesthetic here. I don't want to disguise what it is. I just want to make it sound better. So instead, I know that I'm going to have lots of instruments competing for this mid-range space. And so I just want to make sure that I'm not using space here that I don't need. And remember how I said it was pretty muddy in here. All of this stuff, I'm going to get it out of the way. I'm not quite hearing my low tone. I'm going to ease up a little bit here. Great. And I'm going to do a big wide cue. So I make lots of space in this mid-range where all the instruments are going to compete, but still retain the noisy quality of the refrigerator. So that's what I did. Your mileage may vary. Follow your ears. Now I'm going to show you the last technique. So this is called mirror EQ. And you use mirror EQ to put two things that are basically in the same range in a way that fit together. So it helps things that are competing with each other by making space in just select frequencies. So to do mirror EQ, you first go onto the track that you want to have in the foreground. I'm going to put yet another EQ here just to keep my ideas separate. I'm going to close these up for a moment. Okay, so on my foreground instrument, I want to listen and find the range, the frequency range, where I really want it to project, where it's the most, where it cuts through most clearly. So for me, that's this kind of bright top end here. And then you just give it a little bump. And a little bump is maybe between 2 and 3 dB. 3 dB is generally, rule of thumb, the maximum plus or minus you want to go if you want to retain a natural quality to the original sound. So I'm going to boost by 3 on this high end. And then you take the same EQ, and I'm actually going to copy this EQ, holding Option and dragging onto my bass track. But instead of boosting those frequencies, I'm going to cut them. Just gently. So I've boosted a little bit, and I've cut away the same range on the background track. And we've only very subtly made the background softer, only in this range and only by a little bit. But we've made a window for the foreground to shine through there. And so this is how you can get two sounds in the same range to sit together rather than compete, and rather than having to turn one all the way down or one all the way up. So just to compare, I'm going to turn both of these off and listen for how, first of all, the guitar just needs to be louder. Maybe just a bit. Now I'm going to turn those mirror EQs off. And you might not be able to hear it through Zoom. The sound isn't great. There's just a lot more clarity in the foreground layer there. So why don't you take a moment and do this? EQ8, smooth curve at the brightest, pingiest part of your foreground, cut the same frequency in the background, and I think it's a cool trick just to copy that EQ.
Elliot, I'm sorry. How do you drag out the EQ8 to the other track again?
Click and drag, but hold down Option to copy it.
Gotcha.
Okay, so that's mirror EQ. You should do this whenever you are trying to put a foreground layer on, especially like vocals, because they use up a big part of the range that lots of the other instruments are going to have. So this is a good way to make foreground and background happen. Two rules of thumb with EQ. One is less is more. You're going to get better results making lots of small adjustments on each of your tracks. Big adjustments are going to make your sound artificial, especially if you're working with sounds that refer to real instruments, because we have expectations about what the frequency and overtones of different instruments are. Another rule of thumb is boost wide, cut narrow. And you've seen that I've done this here. So whenever I've done boosts, they're always wide, gentle curves. And whenever I've done cuts, they tend to be narrower or more extreme, as in the low cuts and high cuts. If you have a bunch of stuff like this in your EQ, it just looks crazy to me. It's not right. You shouldn't be doing this to get the sounds that you want. Thanks. Just a second. Okay. Yeah, this isn't right. You shouldn't be boosting narrow, and you shouldn't be boosting this much. Err on the side of cuts, whether they're gentle or narrow, whether they're wide or narrow, but definitely don't boost narrow. Cut narrow, boost wide. And let's talk about the big picture. So this is your whole canvas of your piece. Let me do some undos here. Your whole mix uses this space. To make your music feel like it's in full three-dimensional color, each part of the spectrum should have something interesting in it. You should have interesting stuff in the low parts, the highs, and the mids. If you have many instruments that share some part of the spectrum, they're going to be indistinct and compete with each other. You want to have a mix that's more clear. And so you can make your parts more distinct two ways. One, you can space them out in frequency space so that they are not competing for exactly the same frequency ranges. Or you can space them out in time. If you have, hi-hats and cymbals and shakers and bells, they're all going to be way up high. You could have a part that has all four of those, but don't have them playing at the same time. You have them take turns, spread them out in time, figure out a way for them to fit in together in your arrangement. And then you won't have them try to figure out how to make them fit together in your mix. But yeah, that's the big picture. Just be thinking about how each of your sounds, what parts of this range each of your sounds are taking. And for this, of course, do that ear training sweep exercise so that you know exactly where different parts of your sound are and what they sound like. And think about how they're all fitting together. That is EQ. So we have some more time, and there's one other core concept for mixing that I'd rather just go ahead and do today so that you can start applying this to your music now, and we don't need to wait another week and don't need to use up another class, and we can do more interesting stuff. But I've been sitting at a computer all day. Maybe you have as well. How about we take 3 minutes and stretch and walk around or something? That's what I need. So I'll call you back in a couple. All right, come on back. Okay, so mixing. Part 1, clarity. Part 2 is all about presence. And our main tool for improving the presence of our sounds is compression. So let's compress this guitar track. I haven't tried this before, but I think it's going to work. I just want to get some visual reinforcement of what we're doing. So I'm going to be recording new versions, compressed versions of this so that we can actually see the waveforms changing. I think that's going to be helpful. So in order to record from Ableton to Ableton, you just need to set the routing over here. You can set it to resampling and it'll record everything that's playing, or you can choose which track you want it to listen to. So I'm going to choose guitar and I'm going to hit record. I'm just going to do a real extreme compression of it, and then we'll take a look at it, and then I'll work backwards and explain to you what all has happened. So we've got a little bit of an illusion here because it's turned up the volume a bit, actually quite a lot. So I'm going to turn down the volume just to compensate so that we're looking at apples to oranges. So that's kind of the same range. The peaks are the same anyway. So what compression is compressing is the dynamic range. Compression takes the loudest parts and makes them softer, so that then you can make the softer parts and make them louder. And so here you can tell that we have, you know, this much distance between the quiet stuff and the loud stuff. And well, you can just see here in comparison, the quiet parts of the sound are much fatter. And how that's happened is not actually that you're turning up the quiet parts, it's that it's turning down the loud parts and then boosting everything. So what you're compressing is the dynamic range, the distance between the quietest parts and the loudest parts. So let's talk about how it does this. This is, when you put the compressor on, it's in this mode. It's got 3 different ways of visualizing what's happening. I think the clearest is this third one. So why don't you put a compressor on that guitar track, switch to this third mode, and also click up at top the GR for gain reduction. Okay, got that? So here's what a compressor does. It listens to the sound. It actually looks ahead a little bit. It listens into the future by a certain number of milliseconds. This is a representation of the volume levels. So we can see the peaks in volume hopping out. One way to think about a compressor is that it's there to tame the peaks. So the first thing you need to do is define what a peak is. Well, a peak is, cool, I am listening to this one. So the peak is the volume in excess of a certain threshold that you define. And that's this threshold. So if we turn it down, now everything over the blue that happens is going to engage the compressor. So whenever volume peaks over that threshold, the compressor turns on. When the compressor turns on, basically it just turns down the volume. And it turns down the volume by a certain amount that's expressed by the ratio. So this peak, if we set the ratio to 2 to 1, I'm gonna turn off this, to 2 to 1, it's gonna cut that peak in half. So the resulting peak is going to be half as loud as it would be otherwise. If we turn it to 4 to 1, it's going to cut the peak down by 75%. It's going to cut it to 25% of its original volume. If you turn it up to infinity, it's going to try to chop off the entire top and make the blue line basically be the maximum volume.
Hey, Elliot, we're not hearing both tracks by time, right?
You're not hearing what?
We're not supposed to hear this, both tracks playing at the same time, right? We're only just hearing one.
Yeah, I'm soloed this track and muting this one. Just, this is for visual confirmation of what's happening, but we don't actually want to hear it. Yeah. So that's the compressor. It looks for peaks over the threshold value, and it chops them into some small part. So it'll chop off half at 2, or chop it into a quarter at 4, or chop it all at infinity. And of course, this is taking the top off the volume. So it's really just like as if I were sitting there with my ears, and when I hear a loud sound, I turn the volume down, and then it goes away, and then I turn the volume back up. So it's doing that just automatically. So the next thing to notice is that there's some timing. It doesn't turn on automatically. It takes a little bit of time to turn on after it crosses the threshold, and that's the attack. And you can set a slow or a fast attack. You can also control how fast it lets go. So if I were the compressor and the sound is coming to me and I hear a loud sound, I go, ah, and turn it down. And then I hear, okay, it's soft now, it's safe, I'll turn the volume back up. So the amount of time it takes for me to hear that it's a soft sound and decide that it's safe and turn it back up is the release time. So this is how you can shape the attacks of sounds. If I have a really fast attack and a really extreme ratio, now let me introduce you to this GR line. So when you click GR stands for gain reduction. And this is showing you on the orange line how much it's turning down the volume at any particular time. So you'll see, when I make this more extreme, that each one of the peaks is mirrored exactly up above. And that's because I have infinity all the way up so that it's cutting exactly the overage here. And it looks almost exactly like a mirror image of the peaks because I have the attack really high, really fast. If I turn the attack slower, you can see that it's not on a peak. The gain reduction is less jagged. It's taking a little bit of time. And so I'm getting less extreme and less sudden changes. So it's kind of smoothing out the effect of the compressor. So when you have a slow attack, the peaks actually still get through at the very beginning, and then they get clamped down. And so with a slower attack, you get a punchier sound because you're not chopping off the very beginnings of the sounds. With a faster attack, you get a more mellow sound because then it's taming like almost the very instant that there's a loud impulse. So here's how I think about doing compression on something like this. Let's just listen for a moment. Here's it as off. Here it is on in a really extreme fashion. So I can almost hear the compression kicking on and off. There's this kind of like bouncing of the volume level. And so that's the sound that we want to listen for when the compressor is too extreme. It's just a kind of unnatural and almost like seasick making instability of the volume level because the volume knob is being turned up and down so much. So normally I'm just trying to chop off the peaks. So I set my threshold so just the peaks are through and it's not getting into the sustain of the sound. And if I want a punchier sound, I have a slower attack so the peaks can get through. I like the kind of pinginess of it, so I'm gonna let that be. But I do see here now with on the gain reduction line, I'm not really getting anything happening here. It's just too gentle. So I'm gonna turn down the threshold a little bit more just to get some slight gain reduction. I can click over here and see how much I'm getting. Gain reduction, and I just want, I don't know, I don't want a ton, but I want some. And now I can turn up the volume now that I've tamed the peaks. So there's two ways to do that. One, you can just turn up the volume on the track. But there's also this button called Makeup, and Makeup is going to automatically just turn up the volume on the end. Oh, there's also an output thing here so you can do it manually, but there's this automatic Makeup, which is that the amount of volume that it's going to cut the tops off, it's going to add to everything. And now all of a sudden that's quite loud and present. So actually the loudest moments here with it off theoretically are just as loud as this, except it's almost all that loud now. So I like the Makeup button. You could also do it manually. And now that I'm just hearing a lot more of the sound, I feel like the ratio is too high. An infinity ratio is pretty extreme. So I'm going to dial that back a little bit till I get a bit of a more natural sound. Yeah, that sounds good to me. I have a nice full tail on the sound, so the quiet parts feel nice and full now. But I'm still getting a nice pingy brightness on the front end of those sounds, and it doesn't feel too squashed. So I know that's a lot of information. Feel free to have me explain it again. We could also talk through it on the other representations, which may help your concept. But why don't you give it a try here? Dial in a sound, try some different things, play with the Makeup button, and make sure you're on GR mode, gain reduction, so you can see when it's turning down the volume. and just go exploring. We'll circle back in 3 minutes.
Hey, Elliot,
Yeah.
is the compressor on the first guitar or the second guitar?
So I put the compressor on the first guitar, but then recorded it onto that second guitar track so we could see what the sound waves look like
Okay.
after. But we haven't actually been dealing with this at all.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on that first track.
Elliot,
Yes.
what does knee and look mean?
Yeah, let's talk about this. So look is how far ahead the compressor is looking. I never actually have changed this. It adds a little latency to the track. It delays it a little bit so that it can work. So I suppose you get better results with a higher value, but the trade-off is that it makes your track just a little bit later than your other tracks, and you have to adjust to compensate for that, which you can do by opening up D over here, and you can adjust any individual track by milliseconds. I almost never do that. Knee, however, to think about knee, we should look at this representation. So just because it took me a long time to wrap my head around compression and I had to think about it a bunch of different ways, I'm going to talk you through the same ideas on this graph. So I'm going to turn the ratio down to 0, down to 1 to 1. So this graph shows on the x-axis the input volume. And on the y-axis, it shows the output volume. So when the ratio is 1, say your input volume is this high. Your output volume is also this high. So it's in 2 squares and it's out 2 squares. Cool, so in and out are the same. Same with here. If it's full volume in, then the blue line gets to full volume out on the y-axis. As you turn up the ratio though, oh, and the threshold is that ball. As you turn up the ratio, you bend the whole thing. I'm going to turn off makeup because that's changing things. I'll simplify. So as you turn the ratio knob, it bends everything above the threshold. And that makes sense, right? So now the loudest sound in no longer makes the loudest sound out. It doesn't get all the way to the top. It gets pulled down to here. So my loudest sound in gets chopped off. Everything above this threshold gets chopped off or gets bent. If you turn ratio up to infinity, it means that every sound louder than this threshold input, no matter how loud you get on the x-axis, stays the same volume on the output on the y-axis. So everything over the threshold becomes equally loud when the ratio is infinity. So the knee just changes the shape of this curve. With a bigger knee, you get a more gentle slope. And with a tighter knee, you get a more angled slope. And it's a pretty subtle change to hear. I don't think I can describe what it is, and I'm not sure we'll be able to hear it in this. You just, I think, need to play with it and find some answer that satisfies you, or ignore it most of the time, which is what I do, but probably shouldn't. But basically, I think a gentler knee is going to compress things less, but in the middle range around the threshold, and probably give you just a more natural volume effect here, as transitions in volume here are smoother. Yeah, that's actually probably the best I've ever understood it. Transitions around the threshold are not going to have kind of an unnatural corner in them. They're not going to, they're going to go from softer to louder more smoothly. So that's knee. If you hit makeup, you'll see how makeup works, which is that as you turn up the ratio and you're chopping stuff off the top, it's actually turning up the volume on everything, and your whole graph gets higher. So there's one other knob on here that I use all the time, and that is the dry wet knob. So there's two approaches. One is you compress the sound the way that you want it, normal. The other is that you over compress it and get a really compressed, beefy, but kind of unnatural version of the sound. So here, all of my volumes are all pretty much the same. And this is a much more unnatural version of the sound, but maybe we just mix it in with the dry version. So here is a dry wet knob like on all of our effects. Now we're not hearing the compressor at all. Now we're gradually adding the compressed signal to the dry signal. This is really common on drums, where you want to have the compressed version of the sound to add beefiness to the drums, but you don't want to squash the initial attacks of the sounds, which make the drums punchy. So it's for some historical reason called New York parallel compression, which is a sound from like the 70s of drums when they started to figure this out, that they could mix in a really compressed version of the sound with the dry sound and kind of get best of both worlds, get a really beefy, big tone, huge drum sound, and get the natural attack of the drums mixed in as well. So we're just about out of time. I want to show you one more compression device that you want to use on drums. So compressors, great, multi-purpose on all kinds of things, but there is an effect called the glue compressor, which is specially designed just for drums. And I'm going to put a drum track on here real fast. And great. And make a little house beat here. Cool, so that is our drum track. And on a drum track, they just recommend that you use this glue compressor. And I'm not sure how under the hood it works differently, but they say that it's best for drums. So similar ideas, I mean exactly the same ideas, just a slightly different visual. So we change the threshold. And as we turn it down, we get more and more, and this is the gain reduction. So this is the same as that orange line on our graph before. This is showing me how much volume it's taking off the top. You want a slower attack for a punchier sound, or a faster attack for less punchy. And then you can turn makeup to get more volume on the back end. So here's like a super compressed drum sound. Maybe a high ratio. Mixed in gently. Here's my natural sound. Here's a nice mix of the compressed sound and the dry sound. So the glue compressor is how you can make your drum set sound bigger and beefier and more exciting. I don't know if I also showed you the drum bus, but check out drum bus. I put a drum bus on every drum kit I do and do something usually kind of gentle, but you can really crank it as well to get more drive, like a little gentle warm distortion, a little brighter distortion, a little extra tone down at the bottom that you can tune. It has a compressor in it too. You can't control it, so I prefer to use this. But yeah, so you can play with this also as a dry wet to give your drums more beef, more excitement.
Elliot?
Yeah.
Do you have like a resource or like a dictionary kind of like on a lot of these kind of terms like drive, attack, crunch, damp?
Yeah, so you can, I think the best thing to do is just keep your info view open.
Okay.
And learn about things here. I could look for, yeah, let me look for a glossary for you. I suspect the best way to it is just to try things out and listen to how it changes it and make your own theory. But yeah, let me look for a resource for you. I did find also, so these are the stock plugins that come with Ableton. There is a huge world of plugins that other people make that do all kinds of stuff, including compressors that, you know, emulate like vintage analog compressors from the olden days and impart all different kinds of qualities and color to sound, as well as all kinds of crazy, interesting effects. Lots of them cost money. You could definitely spend a ton of money on plugins, but you don't have to. I want to share with you a list of free plugins. If you're curious about this stuff, there's different synthesizers and effects of all kinds. I'm going to share this with you in the chat, and I'll post it on, where's my chat? There it is. So here's a website, you can explore here if you want to start expanding your range of tools that you have to do this stuff. So next week, I just would like another draft of one or the other of whichever of your songs for your final portfolio. I'd like you to do some mixing. So everybody has a good track going on, a good draft. Why don't you spend a good bit of time this week working on the sound, EQ and compression, and try to get it more clear, less muddy in the mid and low mid range, and just like bigger and brighter, and use compression to make things more present and more loud. You can compress and EQ each individual track, and you should definitely EQ each track. You can compress any track that has a lot of variation in between soft and loud. I probably wouldn't compress this refrigerator just because it's pretty much the same volume all the way through. Maybe I'll tame these things, but I don't know, it's a good character. But you can also put compression, I would suggest doing it gently on your master track. And EQ. So once you have each of your sounds nice and you have them in relative volumes to each other that you like, then you can shape the whole picture with an EQ on your master track. And then I'll just point you to one more thing. Multiband dynamics is a compressor that's good for the master track because it actually compresses the low range and the mids and the highs separately so they don't interfere with each other. So you can explore that and EQ8 on your master track. All right, thanks everybody. I like your music. I'm excited to hear more. Keep it
Thanks,
coming.
Elliot.
Thank you. Bye.